On the city streets, where the buildings get darker as you move away from the wealthier neighborhoods, the atmosphere subtly changes. The streets are narrower, the sidewalks less maintained, and the neon lights of the stores compete in intensity with the light of the flickering street lamps. It was there, in this forgotten corner of the city, that the cafe was located. An almost anonymous place, hidden between aging shops and brick apartments, a place that seemed to belong to another era. Here, the murmurs of the city dissolved into a soothing hum, drowned out by the gentle melody of the coffee machine and the gentle clinking of clinking cups. It was a refuge for lonely souls, those seeking a moment's respite from a tiring day, and for dreamers who, despite hardship, still believed in something greater. The scent of the coffee mingled with that of the wood of the tables worn by time and the passage of customers. The air was thick with smoke, and the dim lighting bathed the space with the intimacy of an old black and white film. Yet, despite this tranquil setting, a dull tension hung in the air. It was a day like any other, but a day when, as fate likes to do, things would change. An unexpected event would disturb this tranquility, and this place would become the place of confrontation of two parallel worlds. Annie Dufresne, a former army general, was sitting at a table near the window. The lightly drawn curtains let in just enough light to illuminate his calm, imposing figure. She was far from military honors, far from tributes and ceremonies. War, strategy, discipline. It was all part of her, engraved in her flesh, in every movement. But today, she was no longer this heroic figure, this woman of command. She was simply a black woman, in her 50s, with a worn winter coat that could not hide the natural presence she exuded. Her gaze, a little distant, seemed to pierce through the walls of the cafe, as if her mind saw beyond the mundane scene unfolding around her. She had moved here a few months ago, after leaving the army and seeking to live a simpler, more discreet life. The battles had ended, and now she wanted to escape past glory. Far from honors and ranks, she yearned for a little tranquility. But life, or perhaps the city itself, seemed to refuse to grant him this luxury. She constantly felt the ghosts of her past following her, her memories of orders given, of soldiers under her command, of overwhelming responsibilities. The army had trained her to handle adversity, to stand firm under pressure. But there was one type of adversity that no amount of military training could ever prepare one to face. That of indifference, everyday racism, and subtle humiliation. That morning, the usually quiet coffee shop vibrated with a different energy. A group of young men had just entered. Their loud laughter broke the tranquility of the place. Dressed in designer clothes, designer jackets, and the latest sneakers, their phones in hand like status symbols that the city had allowed them to acquire, they seemed to want to do more than be seen. They wanted to be noticed, drawing attention to their existence as proof of their importance. They laughed loudly at passers-by, at everything and everyone. One of them made a crude joke about a stranger who had just entered, and the whole group burst into laughter. Their voices, sharp and full of contempt, mixed with the music in the background and the steam escaping from the coffee machine, creating a heavy atmosphere. Annie, who until then had enjoyed the tranquility of this place, felt a change. She felt their gazes weighing on her. She felt them behind her, their eyes trained on her figure. She knew they were looking at her, not because they were interested in her, but because she wasn't like them. She was not a fashionably dressed young woman. She did not have the appearance of the people they considered worthy of their respect. Here, in this corner of the city, she was nothing more than an aging black woman in an out-of-date coat, an incongruous figure in a world that wanted to be young and vibrant. It wasn't that she was used to being ignored. Far from it. In the army, his authority and his stature commanded natural respect. Her decisions, her orders had commanded attention, and even if war was a world of violence, the order she imposed left no room for mockery. But here, in this cafe, far from battles and uniforms, she found herself reduced to a forgotten figure. This bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She concentrated on her book, but the noises of the young men at the next table had become unbearable. The laughter, the whispers between them, the outbursts of voices that mixed with the sound of the spoon in the cup. She could no longer concentrate. Then one of the young people, a tall man with dreadlocks, stood up abruptly, interrupting the litany of laughter. He walked towards her without the slightest hesitation, his face marked by a mocking smile, a disdainful look on his lips. He pointed at her, an unnecessarily theatrical gesture, as if he had just discovered a scene that he considered far too simple and easy to destabilize. "Look at this old woman," he shouted in a loud voice, not caring who might hear him. "What does she think, that she's going to go incognito here? You see, old people are like that. They think they're still young, they want to be respected. But all they deserve is to be ignored," the dreadlocked young man snapped, his words filled with contempt as he looked at Annie with a superior air. He turned to his friends, their laughter echoing loudly, like a pack of wolves feasting on the prey they had just spotted. The other young people, with their youthful faces full of arrogance, joined him without the slightest hesitation, as if the mere idea of humiliating him nourished their sense of superiority. Their laughter mingled with the echo of the ambient music, creating a cacophony that made the air in the café almost unbearable. Annie, however, did not move. She had seen thousands of faces, sometimes hostile, sometimes admiring, but all, in one way or another, recognized her authority. The young man's words, cruel as they were, slipped over her like water over smooth stone. She knew they were trying to provoke her, to humiliate her, to shake her off, to make her the butt of an easy joke. It was not the first time that she found herself confronted with this kind of contempt, this kind of rejection from young people who believed themselves superior to everything. But this time, something about her was different. She had lived too many years of remaining silent, of bowing to unjust judgments, of forcing herself not to respond to provocations. She had been silent in the army when her superiors made choices she found risky. She had had to lower her head in the face of racist and sexist remarks to maintain her career. But today, this verbal violence, this blind lack of respect, presented her with a choice. She wouldn't let it happen. She had learned to master the art of observation, reflection, and patience. This allowed him to survive in a military environment that was as hostile as it was masculine and macho. She was not a defenseless old lady, nor a person on whom insults could be imposed without consequences. She was much more than that. She was a strategist. And in this café, she was going to teach them something more powerful than mockery. She was going to show them the power of dignity, the impact of calm and controlled speech, a power that none of them yet understood. "Am I disturbing you, my young friends?" Annie asked in a calm but firm voice. His tone was serious, measured, but imbued with a natural authority, built over years of leading men and women in situations where the slightest mistake could cost a life. It was not a battle cry, nor a surge of anger. It was a declaration of presence, a moment where attention was focused on her, where her voice and her eyes became instruments of silent judgment. The young people were surprised at first. This was not the answer they were expecting. They had prepared for an emotional reaction, a loud confrontation that they could ignore or downplay. But Annie was not rushing into their trap. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't give in to provocation. She simply observed them, letting them drown in their own mockery. But more than anything, she knew they had no idea what they were up against. Maybe they thought this lonely woman in the corner of a café was an easy target. They were wrong. The tallest of them, the one with the dreadlocks, laughed harder, the sound of his voice spilling into the space like a shard of broken glass. He stood up, approached Annie with arrogant slowness, his arms crossed, a mocking smile spreading across his lips. "Oh, that's it. The old woman wants to teach us lessons." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze searching Annie's face, a challenge in his eyes. "You know, there are places for people like you. It's not here. You thought you were someone, right?" Annie remained still. She hadn't moved an inch, but the tension around her seemed to crystallize, as if time itself had suspended. She slowly placed her cup of coffee on the table, her hands, although marked by age, solid as the earth they had worked for a lifetime. Her gaze fixed on the young man in front of her, her dark eyes boring into the arrogant youth's. In his eyes, there was no anger, no hatred, just deep concentration. She knew exactly where she was going with this. "You want to take me out?" she asked calmly, her gaze never leaving the young man's. "Because I'm black? Because I'm a woman?" Or because you think you're more valuable than me?" The young man shrugged his shoulders carefree, his mocking smile displaying obvious contempt, but beneath this facade of arrogance, a slight uneasiness gradually settled into his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He thought that, like so many others, he could afford to demean this elderly woman, to ridicule her simply because of her appearance. But Annie Dufresne was not just an old lady, and even less a black woman with no history. Behind his wrinkles hid a life of command, of battles, of victories won with implacable strategy and unwavering courage. She had led soldiers, men and women who respected her not because of her age or her color, but because of her inner strength, her ability to make crucial decisions under pressure, to face adversity without flinching. She had taken lives into her hands and protected them. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Not today. Not by him. "You think you can humiliate me like that, because you see an old black lady in front of you?" Annie asked, her voice calm, but each word striking the air with deadly precision, like an arrow shot straight to the heart of the young man's arrogance. "Let me tell you something. I've commanded battalions. I've made decisions that have affected entire lives, human lives. And you? What have you done to deserve respect? What have you accomplished besides making fun of others?" Annie's words echoed through the room like a clap of thunder. The young man, petrified, remained frozen for a moment, as if time had stood still around him. He had never imagined such a calm, yet impactful response. Suddenly, his mocking laughter had disappeared, as if erased by the weight of Annie's words. He looked in her eyes for an escape, but her words had stuck with him, imposing a truth he was not prepared for. The other group of young people who accompanied him quickly fell silent. They exchanged uncertain glances, embarrassed by the aura of command that Annie gave off. The atmosphere in the cafe instantly changed. The noise of conversations, the background music, everything became more distant, as if the outside world had dissolved around this confrontation. The humiliation was now theirs. For those who, blinded by their own arrogance, had not seen the dignity hidden behind the marked features of this woman. The young people, feeling uncomfortable, began to get up silently. The tallest of them, the one with the dreadlocks, slowly lowered his eyes, as if caught in the grip of his own shame. He tried to regain his confidence, but something inside him had broken. He had not only lost his duel with Annie, he had just understood, in a split second, that respect is not obtained through mockery, but through humanity. A respect that he and his friends had not yet learned to give. They moved away, pushing their friend forward, like children in a hurry to flee a place where their indifference was no longer tolerated. They left the cafe, stealing glances back, unable to understand why the situation had taken such an unexpected turn. Annie did not get up. She watched them leave with the serenity of a general who, after observing the battlefield, knows victory without another word. A slight smile touched his lips, but it was not a resounding victory. It was not the revenge of a trampled woman, nor the apotheosis of a moment of glory. It was the victory of dignity, of wisdom acquired at the cost of many years of internal and external struggles. She didn't have to humiliate them, to lower them to their own level. His strength lay in his silence after the storm. It wasn't about revenge. It was a lesson in respect, humility, a truth that it was up to him to pass on to them, without imposing it. In that little cafe that day, she wasn't just an ex-general. She was not just a black woman. She was a woman who had lived long enough to know that sometimes the greatest strength lies in tranquility and dignity in the face of adversity. She wore this dignity like invisible but indestructible armor. The murmurs in the cafe began to dissipate, and the usual noise of the place slowly returned to normal. The conversations resumed their place, the cups were filled again, the waiter continued his work. But one thing had changed. In this small scene, this innocuous confrontation, a greater truth was imposed on everyone. No matter where you come from, what you have been through, dignity cannot be denied. And sometimes, the greatest lesson does not come from fiery speeches, but from the calm voice of a veteran, of a person who knew how to take his time, who took the world by surprise with a simple but heavy word. It's her, this quiet voice, which eclipses the noises of the arrogant. Annie raised her coffee cup again, her piercing gaze straying for a moment into the crowd of the cafe. It wasn't a victory that would change the world, but today, in this place, she knew she was no longer invisible. She had taken her place, without shouting, without making noise. And that was enough. She was no longer just a memory. She was there, and she was not to be ignored.